Welcome everybody to the April OWASP Austin chapter meeting. Our meeting is sponsored by our annual conference, LastCon, for the food and National Instruments for the facilities here. I'm Tiana Chandler, the chapter leader, and I've listed up here the other folks in our chapter leadership. If you're here, raise your hand just so that there's a few people around here. So if you have any questions about the chapter, you can reach out to us and we'll be glad to talk with you. This meeting is eligible for 1 hour CPE, and the way we do it for now is if you just email me, I can send you a certificate so that you can have that. There's several ways to support OWASP, volunteer opportunities, whether you want to get involved with the leadership, speaking like here at these monthly meetings, or any other local events we may have around here. So, and also if you shop on Amazon, like probably most people do, if you use the Amazon Smile, there's a portion of that that can go towards OWASP. To participate in these meetings, as well as any of the other documentation and other resources that OWASP provides, you do not have to be a member. However, just giving back to us, you can also sign up for a membership, whether it's individual, corporate, and we even have the student membership. And you can go to austin.owasp.org to find out more information about that. Also, Paul Griffiths, he's our membership coordinator. So if you have any questions about membership, please see him. As many of you probably know, we've switched our OWASP Austin chapter mailing list. It's now using Google Groups. I think it was Mailman before that. It was an older technology that was being used and they were having problems. So in austin.owasp.org, you can find the link. It's towards the top of the page if you haven't signed up. We usually use this mailing list just to announce the upcoming meetings. We don't really publish much to it, so you won't get inundated with a lot of emails. We have weekly study groups, and I believe the current one going on is Web Hacking 101, and it meets in Building A here in National Instruments during the lunch hour on every Thursday. Matt Pardo, I don't think he's here. He's our education coordinator, but you can reach out to him. Also, if you join the Austin OWASP Slack channel, there's for hashtag Web Hacking 101, you can follow the progress of that and join. For this year, our Lone Star Application Security Conference, or LastCon, show of hands, how many people have been to LastCon in the past? Wow, so there's a lot of you that have not. That's actually good. So we welcome folks that are new. This is our 10th year anniversary, so we're trying to make it extra special. And so we have a website at lastcon.org if you want to find out more information on that. And if you would like to present or even provide any training, there's CFPs and CFTs that are open that you can submit. Just go to that website. Upcoming chapter events. I have a placeholder here for other training. We have talked before about having other just one-off trainings, but at this point we have nothing planned, so just stay tuned for anything with that. And to my knowledge, I believe there is an Awesome Security Professionals Happy Hour going to be coming up in May at Baby Acapulco's. I will be sending out an Eventbrite on the details of that just to confirm that. So just look out for that if you're on the mailing list. And also I should mention, any of the events is also in our austin.owasp.org wiki page. So even if you're not on the mailing list, you could still go there and see what are the upcoming events. Just have listed here just a few other local events, the ISC Squared, ISSA chapter meetings, and Cloud Awesome monthly meeting. And didn't know if anybody else had any other events that they know about that they wanted to mention. Okay. Also have take a time now for any job opportunities. If your employee, you work for a company that actually has some job openings that maybe other people might be interested in.
Hi, I'm Jeff Frost, VP of Infrastructure Engineering at a company called Procore. We do construction management software as a service, hosted on AWS, looking for security engineers, SREs, application developers, probably lots of other things that I'm not aware of. We're downtown on 6th in the Chase building. If you're interested, hit me up after.
Okay.
Myself and Craig are from AWS Security. We came because it was an AWS topic, but the AWS Security team is hiring a lot here in Austin. So if you guys are interested, find us, I guess. He will give you his phone number.
Anybody else? Okay. And so now I'd like to present Diane Volere with Securing AWS, a real-world case study.
Thank you so much. And this is absolutely much more interesting since I have the AWS security team here. Thanks for coming. No. Because that'll keep me honest. I mean, I absolutely want to be honest in this process. So make sure, am I working? I'm working, good. So thank you so much for the introduction, Tiana. As you can see, I am Diana Volere. I am, I've noted up there, I am CCSP, CISSP, and all those credentials, but at heart, I am a geek. I am a fan of cybersecurity. I am passionately devoted to helping organizations make that sort of digital transformation if they have legacy stuff, and have an easy channel to be able to reach their customers, be able to take care of their employees, be able to take care of their products, their development, without ending up exposed on the front page for having terrible security breaches. And when I say I'm passionate about this, the organization that I work for, which I won't belabor at the moment, but I recently received the title of Chief Evangelist. So y'all are in trouble because I can talk. That's all I'm saying. So as we go through here, I recognize that OWASP has a slightly different focus than some of what we would call AWS security in some ways. There are some things that align, we talk about misconfigured security or insecure application coding, things like that, where they'll overlap, and some areas where they might seem a little bit disparate. But I'm hoping that being able to give you an understanding of how a major Fortune 500 organization was dealing with AWS security, some challenges they found based upon their environment and ways that they dealt with it, will help you in your consideration as you're moving along in your own development, your own career, your own organizations. So without further ado, let me talk about this case study. Our organization was engaged to work with a Fortune 500 company that was in the process of moving to AWS, moving all of their application development there, moving a number of their live production environment there. And they were finding in that process that they had a few challenges that they were dealing with, because partially of their own practices, because of gaps that they felt in the way their processes were set up. And really, they didn't know how to handle it, so they were talking to us. And some of those challenges, most of them were around identity and access. Like, how did I know that the person who was a developer last week and got terminated, oh crud, I left their AWS admin account active so they still had access for a long time? Or how do I know where somebody got privileges for something, or they had an audit, it was a little bit painful? Some of the things that they were not enabled to deal with based upon their history, their legacy, and how they were going about implementing. So I'm really going to go over 6 particular challenges they had, talk about why each one actually matters. This isn't just out there, oh, this was uncomfortable because things were slow. Why it significantly impacted their organization and how we actually came to help them with it. Most of my focus is around identity and access, and I'm not talking about literally any product here. This is mainly disciplines, things you can do regardless if you're doing some sort of identity management or access management solution. And some of it are just disciplines around how you deal with things organizationally. So all of their challenges around securing it we found into 3 different categories. Some are around visibility, seeing what actually people had going on and proving the compliance of it. Some around privileged access management. You know, how do I know who has admin access to what? And some of it around identity lifecycle. So as I get through these, I'll break them down into these 3 categories, and yeah, away we go. Because the first area around visibility, being able to know what was going on, there were a couple of things they wrestled with. And people from AWS, if I am missing anything obvious or something I should know, tell me. The first one that they had, when you were creating identities in AWS through the console, right? I want somebody to be able to have an AWS user. That user is tied to groups, tied to roles. The groups and roles and the user can be tied to policies that say what they can access, what they should be able to do with it, what those security parameters are. And from that, I know what I can do with services. And we call these local users when you create them directly there through the console, which is a little different from me. When I think of local users, I'm thinking of like my workstation, I have local user login type thing. But same sort of concept. So they had somebody manually going, creating users there, adding access to them, giving them their policies, giving them groups and roles, allowing them to do what's called assume roles when they want to do particular tasks. Now, assuming roles allows somebody who does not have the rights or privileges to do something to take on a role to be able to do it for a particular time. And this is not going to be as visible to people in the back. But straight up from a command line, if you want to come forward, I wish I could blow this up there. What this looks like is, you know, I'm going to type, yes, I want to assume a role. I give the Amazon resource number. I give the details of the role. And at the end of it, I name my role session. And hopefully that role session is something like update database per ticket 1234, or, you know, spin up new server instance, or delete unnecessary users, right? Hopefully it's something descriptive. But unless you put in this constraints, it doesn't have to be. In this case, it's test 1, 2, 3. Now, one of the big challenges with that was, as you're going through and trying to understand who actually used that, in some of the logging tools, you'll look and it'll say the session name that was given to the assumed role session as opposed to the person who actually did it. So I can see, hey, you know, at this time, if I'm looking at the APIs, what happened? This is the activity that was taken. But I don't always have, you have to go to a couple of different logs and do some, you know, resolution, et cetera, to get a good answer on the who did what. And this organization was struggling with that because they had a few unusual things happen internally, and they had a very hard time figuring out, hey, who is my disgruntled employee? I don't actually know. So as an identity and access management person, man, yeah, you can see this at least reasonably well. Some of the things that we do to help with that and things that we suggest are actually starting by putting in place a sort of centralized store that can take what are the IAM groups, roles, policies, everything from AWS, and bring that into that central store and align it with what you're pulling from HR. So it's no longer just Jay Doe has an AWS account. It's actually John, who works in IT and is actually doing this role from HR, is tied to this AWS account. And, you know, hopefully when he leaves the organization, I also terminate it. But beyond just that, we also can pull in access details, like not just what policy, you know, at a high level is fine, but get into a very granular, here's the sort of access at a very detailed level that this person has. Rather than having to go to different places to try and understand it, I have one dashboard, and I have a bunch of controls to apply to it. You can do this with, you know, define your security controls, apply them, and have that central place to review and deal with it. So what we were looking at was, hey, high privileged users having cross AWS account access. You can actually look at that, look at the history of what happened with it, view that history, see when somebody assumed roles, and examine violations from a central point where it's all reconciled together. They found this extraordinarily helpful at tracking down some of the problems they were having. Now, the second challenge, though, some users were created like right in the console, local users, federated users. You here do federation to AWS? Anybody here use federation at all? Am I talking to the wrong crowd? You can tell me that. I'll tell you this really quickly because it is relevant in some ways to almost every aspect of security. They didn't want to have to for everybody, all right. Midway through their implementation, they stopped creating local users and they wanted to create federated users. So an individual user didn't go and log into AWS. They just logged into their local Azure AD or ADFS that they had, and they had a group membership based on that. And that was the provider, and was trusted by AWS. So they go to sign into AWS, and at that point, based on what group membership they have on premise, whatever group it is, it gives them a role in AWS. I'm in the AD group AWS admin. I sign into AWS through this sort of single sign-on experience, and I have the role AWS admin. Practical, easy to do. The challenge for them was an auditor came in and wanted to know, hey, what does that role actually do? And they said, well, it's for AWS admin. But they didn't have in the tool where they were tracking who had access to what that actually led to in AWS. So they had an audit finding because they couldn't answer the question, what did John Doe, who's in the federated group AWS admin, actually have at a granular level of access in AWS? So they were missing all this access visibility. They didn't have an easy way to get that tied together with this federated group and the way they'd configured things, and they really needed a way out of this. So, okay. So again, we start talking about how we solve issues like this with an identity governance, identity management sort of solution. And it comes back to, again, I want to take all of those federated roles. And just like I was taking the users previously and pulling all of their data in, I want to take the federated roles and pull in what all of their access is, match that to the group that's coming out of your Okta, your Azure AD, whatever you're using for federation technologies. And with that, be able to look at things like, hey, what does this role actually give me access to in a very fine-grained detail in AWS? And then we actually have the ability to look at what AD accounts are associated with AWS roles. So it's not just what roles are going on in AWS, but what am I doing in Active Directory that's tied to AWS? So from their perspective, once they could show this to the auditor's like, oh, I like you again. You're not in trouble again. And it was much more cost effective than dealing with it any other way. That's the access visibility side of it. The third one, I was talking about visibility and compliance being tied. Everybody loves compliance, right? Nobody ever says yes to that. Well, it is one of those pains that has a very high cost when we don't bother with it at all. And they were facing, this particular organization had PCI, SOX, and some IT general controls. IT general controls, no big deal. SOX, PCI, painful, painful. And so the challenge around those controls is being able to get this visibility into where my control can identify risk, where I can identify violations. And it's not just what you'd think of in my financial accounting application. It's across all the sort of objects. Oh, there's some weird word wrapping here. All the objects that they actually had in AWS. And this, being able to report on the compliance of those. Okay, what do I mean in a very granular detail? I'm setting up an EC2 instance. Do I know that that one is actually secure? Spinning up a database. Have I encrypted it? Oh, it's going to have PII in it. Do I actually spin it up in a secure fashion so that it's encrypted and it's not going to be something that violates all of these different regulations I'm supposed to be meeting? So they were concerned about that. In challenge 3 and 4, I've kind of grouped them because they're sort of the same thing. And then once they got compliant, they wanted to get compliant with all that, understand their security posture, and then they wanted to stay compliant in a continuous fashion, right? So it wasn't this point in time of, we scanned our environment, everything's good. No. It's more focused on this continuous process. I need to always be monitoring, did somebody just spin up a database, and an unencrypted database? Is there an S3 bucket that they didn't block the ports to? Is there an EC2 instance that's I need to have that constant monitoring of it. That's what they were dealing with. They needed to be able to constantly address that. And they needed to, when something like that happened, follow up with it real time immediately, get a notification, deal with the analysis of it, see what they're violating, and respond immediately. Not 6 months later, not even 1 month later, not even a week later. I mean, if you read any of the data breach investigation reports, not paying attention to this is something that gets you highlighted a lot in the news right now. So they want to have a continuous monitoring of that. So the process of getting compliant and staying compliant. Well, there's something I want to discuss around this is when I talk identity management or identity governance, I'm really talking about, hey, I want to be able to, it's not carbon-based life form necessarily. I want to be able to take something, thing, that has a name, that has a set of descriptive attributes, and that has policies that can be assigned to it, right? Well, we consider a S3 bucket. We consider a database. We consider an EC2 instance. We consider any of that, an identity as well. So we plugged into this deep integration with AWS Services, watched for events to come through, had the secure query service there, queuing service. I will say query when I see that. Like, take those events, watch when we had things created consistently, and get notifications on it. A bucket was just created, a database was just brought up, et cetera. Real-time notification of that, going to the identity governance system that would take that identity, compare it to the policies that were in place, like, oh, I need to match HIPAA, this one has patient data, and is it matching this policy? And govern that real time. If it wasn't matching policy, wasn't matching the controls I had in place, shut it down. Notify somebody who should be notified. Create a ticket in Jira, there's a problem with this. But have that true continuous dealing with the security problems. So, and it's kind of interesting when we start doing that is how quickly the help desk gets a call of, hey, I'm trying to spin up an instance and it's not working. I see you've tried to spin up 5 instances and you're doing them all wrong. You get that though. It's a very real challenge, and then you can have that more proactive security conversation. I know nobody likes being on the side where they get called and said, oh, I didn't encrypt that, I'm sorry. But being able to do that proactively and start incorporating that in practices real time, much easier than dealing with the painful process of finding out after the fact when you're in the papers. All right, that's the identity side of things, or the visibility side of things in compliance. A little bit dense, I know, but are there any questions on that? Please.
So, do you see like kind of out in the field that companies are? Are you seeing more out in the field that companies are maintaining, spinning up these services kind of as a group and then providing that out to development teams, or just allowing development teams to kind of take whatever they want to do with it?
So I think we can say that historically, as DevOps became much more common, or when it first started, the swell of the DevOps movement, you would see much more development teams were released to do whatever they wanted, right? Hey, here's sort of the environment. Nobody really monitored that. It was a fair amount of independence, and that led to some incredibly fast developments. Talking about the left shift and the way that we actually develop is so much more agile, and I would say the communication between departments, when you actually have a DevOps methodology in place, that culture is so much better. But especially in the past few years, we have seen the DevSecOps become much more pronounced, where instead of just saying, hey, here's your environment, you go, it becomes much more common to say, hey, we need to get our arms around this a little bit. I've got some more conversation around that as we go on, but any other experiences in that space? DevOps to DevSecOps, kind of a transition everyone's experiencing? Is the lunch like really making you tired? Because you're not going to tell me I'm boring. I'm not going to take it out. So we will get on to that a little bit more around lifecycle management and some in this. So privileged access management. Anybody use a PAM solution on-premise? They're used to go and check out an account and a password in order to be able to do any sort of privileged activities? Nobody? Okay. So thank you. In a lot of environments, what they do is rather than having somebody have the SA account all the time and log into that, or a root account, or the domain admin account, instead of somebody having access to those accounts all the time, for security purposes, they actually put them in a checkout box, where if you want to use it, you have to go request it, fill out a reason for it, and then securely you are given a temporary password to go be able to log in, do your activities, and you're done. Privileged account management. It keeps people from having, 30 people have the password to the admin account and who knows who did something. Instead, it gives you this time box. This person had the password between the hours of 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. when somebody happens to delete the production database instead of the backup database. We know which threat to choke. So privileged access management becomes a really significant challenge when you start trying to do this in the cloud. And there's a few key reasons. The first one is part of the cloud's appeal is its elasticity. I have a need to swell and have an additional 200 servers to meet customer demand this weekend. They're all being spun up immediately. How do you actually provision secure accounts to all those servers? And how do you connect to them? Like one of the things you see on-premise is that you'll use an intermediate server you call the jump box, and you connect to that, and that connects to the server. So you don't ever have a direct connection to whatever is your secure server. It's called the jump host. You can't do that sort of gateway-based technology in the cloud. It's just not possible with the elasticity and scaling nature of it. You also can't easily get machines quickly bootstrapped and rolled out with that pre-configured PAM in place most of the time. So some of this has to do with the SSH keys and password vaulting, et cetera. But as you're trying to speedily roll things out, it becomes a big roadblock to that. And part of the reason you want that in the cloud is because you want to be able to know who is actually doing what activity when, and to monitor them so that the person, it used to be that taking down your entire data center was a little bit more of a challenging activity. But nowadays, one rogue admin who has the right access can do devastating things to your production instances, to your whole posture in the cloud. Your data center can be down like that. So we need to tie those tools into it. They're like identity governance that know that the right person has access to when they should and can actually monitor real time what they're doing. And the on-premise ones, it's easy to do that on-premise. In the cloud, it's harder. It's harder to do that additional integration. And most of them don't have a lot of audit capabilities. So, okay, this is kind of, we're at sort of a theoretical level. Let me tell you literally what the examples are of this. There are at least 7 different ways when you are using AWS or infrastructure as a service that you have privileged accounts that you probably want to keep track of. Right? 7 different ways. For a typical organization, that's a lot of conduits, a lot of channels. Somebody could be going to the management console and doing some just-in-time, I need to give somebody access to this right now, directly at the AWS console, right? They could be doing it from the command line. Somebody could be doing privileged activities there, and how do they actually get the session to be able to do privileged activities is one of those challenges that they have to bear. And this customer was really wrestling with that one, by the way, just telling you. They need to be able to have privileged access to workloads that are being spun up. And this goes back to that, hey, I just spun up 200 instances. How am I going to guarantee root on each of those instances is secure and only given to the person who's supposed to have it? Cloud databases, spinning up a cloud database. When you spin up a cloud database, there's not a lot of inherent administrative privileges to it, like one rate account. How do I get down to a row, column, table level of what somebody should be able to see and administer very quickly? And then the DevOps tools. I'm a big fan of DevOps. I'm going to be very candid. I really love it. I also see a lot of potential. A while back, I was working with an organization that somebody checked in to a code repository online, all of the keys that they were using to authenticate in the software. And somebody was out there scanning those repositories and happened to get it. I'll talk about the sort of risks that you undergo in that. So being able to guarantee that you are doing things like very secure processes, a person is only importing something to a repository when it's right, your infrastructure as code, your cookbook is not being tweaked by somebody out there to make sure that, to guarantee that there are things open or misconfigured. These are the sort of areas that we don't see a lot of governance historically. But that's part of that whole privileged account management thing, is privileged ability to go in and edit your organizational cookbooks. Because that really is a huge risk right there. If you want to talk about ways that we've seen some very interesting hacks recently, that's one where there's one that just happened recently with an organization, which shall remain unnamed, that had somebody go in and change everything in the cookbooks to actually allow somebody to come in over an insecure port to every machine that they spun up. It went poorly. Wait, sorry, I rushed that one. Now, Lambda functions. We use Lambda functions internally at my organization, right? I want to back up a database, I want to spin one up, I want to bring it down. It's really nice to have these serverless functions. They're very clean snippets of code and a different way to do things than we've done them before. One of the big problems with that is that you don't see a lot, like, it's an automated, okay, I put the function out there, it's there. Who knows when that's changed? Who's monitoring that function to be sure that it hasn't had some tweaking internally on the code that it shouldn't have? Because almost all its Lambda functions have privileged capabilities, right? I mean, it's going to do something that's a privileged action. So they're assigned to a privileged role, and they found at this organization that they were just leaving them out there tied to a privileged role. Somebody was changing them. They didn't really know when that happened again. So it all comes back to that same process of not knowing who is taking action in this privileged fashion. API is the same thing. You need to have a role that was privileged to run it. People need to have privileged access to use it. And there was not a lot of governance around what's going to do that. Now, let me be honest. With this many conduits, there is no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet that's going to take it all out and make it all go better. So what we focused on were some design strategies and patterns to help the organization be able to get their arms around all of this. And sure, we have solutions in place about this, but some of those patterns were, rather than giving perpetual elevated access to something, to really make sure it's very time-bound. If I'm going to have a Lambda function that I know needs to make a privileged call every night between 3 and 4 a.m., elevate its privileges at 2:59 and de-escalate them at 4:01. If I have somebody who needs to have access to do some secure database maintenance, rather than just saying, at all times you have access to that, elevate their ID, right? When they need to do it, take Volere's account and make me a member of the SA group at that time, and then remove me as soon as it's done. And this is a little bit of a pain when you are on the side where you're used to all this access, right? I mean, it is. I've been in the days and I didn't have to go through anybody to promote something to production, and that was very nice in some ways. But consistently we are seeing in the industry very bad exposure coming from that. It's much safer to actually rely on something like that temporal access. We also focused on that workload discovery and auto registration. So a lot of times what PAM solutions do is they'll wait till the weekend and then go through and move privileged accounts onto everything that's been spun up during that week. No, you can't do that in such a dynamic and elastic world as you have when you start working with infrastructure as a service. So instead of waiting until the weekend, you need like a real-time auto discovery of workloads to watch what's being spun up and deal with it immediately, copying privileged accounts to it. And this is only practical for people trying to work on these, right? As opposed to having to go through putting in a help desk ticket, trying to get something done for the server you've just spun up, to just know that I spin it up like 2 minutes later, it's going to have gone through its registration process and I can check out the account for it. Much smoother. That's security enabling business as opposed to getting in the way of it. SSH key distribution and credential vaulting. Really we had to come up with disciplines for how we were going to do this, where you would take credentials and allow if you needed to have service to service or somebody who needed to authorize to access a secure session, how you dealt with getting those key distributions in the credential vault was one of the key things we had to get their minds wrapped around and get everybody to buy in that we're going to keep things in a central store. We're not going to have SSH keys stored on my desktop here and I'll share it with you over email or something like that. No, it has to be handled in a secure fashion. And then we focused on having privileged a session manager that allowed you to connect as a privileged account, but still had the ability to say things like, hey, you're executing a command, star.star or rd-r, something like that, seems a little suspicious to me. I actually don't think we're going to let you execute that. If you want to do that, pop up information, here's what you need to do. When you can get to controlling that actual, what people are typing and having certain things that you don't want to have happen, that's what we needed to recommend to this organization because they were having a little bit of abuse in the space and actually implement there. Service accounts, this was one of the last ones, service account lifecycle management, being able to guarantee that everybody who had a service account for some application that was running, that it had its own lifecycle. We knew who the owner was of that account, and they knew what was going on with it. They would be the person responsible. If they left, there was an automatic rollover to the next person, an inheritor who would be the owner, who, theoretically at least, knew what was going on with it. So a lot of pains around this privileged account management. And last part was really keeping this audit log in place for them so that they had an easy support to go and look at what was happening real time. When you are in the cloud and you're generating audit logs, holy heck, do they take up a lot of space. You have so much activity going on. So, once we started setting up logging for them so they could do things like research what activity was taken on this system at this time, we actually had to make it cloud native because it started taking up space and it needed that elasticity of the cloud. You're welcome, AWS. A few other principles that we put in place. You couldn't do a jump box. You can't do jump box technology when you're living in the cloud. If anybody's, that may mean nothing to most people, but just that notion of session termination and reinitiation doesn't work. It doesn't work to have set clients that need to have static addresses. I mean, you're used to, I want to SSH into something on my server list of 20 servers. I know which server. It does not work well when you are dealing with such a dynamic environment. And sometimes you see like an entirely separate governance for this. It tends to work poorly. We did have a few things that we thought were really important. If you try to make people sign in again, that becomes really painful. Nobody likes that. So SSO was still considered critical to deliver to them and to also be aware if somebody is doing something that violates risk or SOD. SOD, segregation of duty. You don't have a lot of this enabled. You, I say you, collective you, I mean collective me. If it's not collective you, good on you. But generally it's true that there's not a lot of SOD enabled around anything monitoring infrastructure right now. You don't see a lot of, hey, somebody who does stuff in dev, probably I don't want them to roll directly to prod. There should be like that process. We should be able to have a segregation of duty around when somebody's doing something and be aware of the risk. That's part of the better accountability as well. And the last one was it had to be cloud native. You can't start with something on premise to monitor all of the cloud stuff and think that you're going to scale to encompass it. It just wasn't real. So these were what we were focusing on for them. And why it mattered for them, well, I said the first one that they had people on premise doing things that they shouldn't do. They could not keep their infrastructure stable because they had a little bit of a DevOps spaghetti problem, candidly. I mean, they didn't have some very solid processes in place there, which we could have a longer conversation around DevOps and DevSecOps, but I'll refrain from too much of that. But once they started instituting, okay, we're going to have to put policy in place. We have to come at things from a security posture. They found that a lot of the challenges they were facing around what's going on here slowly began to filter away. So for them, it was very valuable. Bring it. Identity governance administration. Sorry, identity, that is my problem. I tend to think everybody knows what IGA is, like SOD or something. Please call me if there's any acronym, and I'm like, let me leave it out in limbo. Thank you. Questions around the privileged account stuff?
I have questions, and at some level, you still have a God user somewhere. So, I mean, at some point, you still have a God user somewhere.
Yes.
And
you have to have some account, absolutely. It's got that. So what we usually see people doing, what we see as a best practice, is that the God account itself, like a root account, like anything else, as soon as you have used it to create, a secondary account, that's one that we put into that secure lockbox state. Nobody else logs into it. The password is changed by a system that controls it. Now, at a bottom line, if you're somebody who has access to the guts of everything and you can go into the hard drive at a bits and bytes level and rewrite certain files, there are ways around almost anything security-wise like that. Almost every PAM solution out there has ways you can circumvent it if you're really, really determined to circumvent it. But then you have to, then you have to do things like real-time SIEM logging around it, which watches if somebody tampering with this file. So it's who watches the watchers a little bit. And it becomes kind of that chain of this, somebody's tampering with this that I'm watching, and so I know that they're going to be tampering with a secure account, and so that's why you end up with sort of these cycles of watching your PAM solution while it watches other people. You can monitor for stuff like that to try and prevent it. And if somebody wants to go and disable the monitoring and then do something, I mean, it becomes consecutively harder the more you put in place of that sort of real-time SIEM solution around it. SIEM, Security Information and Event Management Solution, that's one that you put in place that will do something like monitor files for suspicious activity, monitor applications for integrity. Helpful? The God account will still exist. I mean,
well, I mean, at AWS,
sure.
You always have a root account. And so you're suggesting that, first off, you have multi-factor and you only use that root account when you need to be God. And the rest of the time you keep it, locked and hidden under a blanket or something.
Yes.
And then I guess my follow-up is, are you using CloudTrail then for your resource access monitoring? And what are you?
So there's a couple of different ones, like CloudTrail, and AWS CloudTrail is one of the ones that we'd pull in and ingest. What I would recommend, and this has nothing to do with my organization, is things like a full-scale SIEM or CAGI solution that's watching real-time access that's going between on-premise and cloud and monitoring that for suspicious activity. You can tie in with that, like user behavioral analytics of, hey, somebody's logging into my root account at a weird time and this becomes suspicious, and trigger instant responses to it. But it's really a defense and depth layered security that you want to deal with that most privileged account like you're talking about. So that's why I was saying it's not a silver bullet. There's no like perfect and 100% secure answer to it, but it's absolutely lock it down immediately, have some sort of checkout process to it. Something else you can consider instead of letting people use that as much as possible, if somebody needs to do activity that requires a high level account, like high level of access, see if you can temporarily elevate their privilege to do so with their own account rather than using the root account. That's one of the other policies that we try to put in place, is a temporary elevation. You're correct that if somebody is super determined, if you don't have the right employees and trustworthy people and you have somebody inside, it can be very hard to truly stop them.
Were you able to put a timer on them?
Yes.
So
yes.
automatically it gets revoked?
Yes, so it automatically gets revoked and the password gets changed by a system process. But, could somebody hack the system process? Yes. I mean, there's always going to be a yes eventually at that. Security, one of the things that we talk about, CISSPs in the room, one of the things we talk about in security is that security is never absolute. You have to just continually make it harder for someone to break it so that the trouble of doing so does not exceed the value of doing so. And sometimes with, especially with privileged accounts, that's why I say there's a certain realm of things you can do to protect it. And consistently we try to add more and more layered strategy into that. But there is always that vulnerability why you want to keep monitoring and you want to keep trying to stay on top of it. Build a better level of security, and there will absolutely be somebody out there ready to hack it soon. like in the front row, Josh, hello, my name is Hacker, you know, as an example. Is that helpful, the discussion around that? I mean, I recognize it's not a perfect answer of, hey, we can completely solve that. We can help put in place, you can help put in place, your organizations can help put in place policies and procedures that'll help make it harder. Anything else? Talk to me later. So the third one is around identity lifecycle management. Did you here do anything with identity lifecycle? I at least saw one hand back. Oh, a couple hands, okay. At least I'm talking to someone there. So one of the areas that they found very much a challenge was that they had people coming into the organization. Once they got to that sort of provisioning state, somebody comes on board, they get access. They had a lot of trouble dealing with, they had disconnected HR. Somebody moves from one organization to another internally. They're internally, I don't mean from one job to another, I mean just within one org to another internally. Their access and what they're working on should change automatically, right? What happened was people would consistently start gaining access because they'd take on a new job, but you never stop doing the old job really, right? I mean, nobody's ever free. There's no parole, there's the promotion in that regard. So they found that people were accumulating access privileges. Like somebody who'd been, you know, working in the organization for like 6 years, had access to everything under the sun. And then somebody new would come on board and they'd be trying to figure out, hey, what access should we be giving him? Oh, just make him like the other guy. Been here for 5 years. The access under the sun. So there was, is that me? I don't think that's me. Okay. So there were some inherent challenges that they had around keeping up with that. And so this is where we were bringing in, and this is really the sweet spot of an identity governance access solution that starts communicating with HR first, watches those changes and events. So somebody joins, somebody's leaving, and as those events happen, compare those against outlier policies. Hey, John's access looks very similar to the other 5 people in his department, but Joe's is extraordinarily more. That's an outlier access that you can examine and say, maybe there's a reason for this, but maybe we should look at it. Or segregation of duties, or things around what your business policy would be. So you can start examining those every time you have an event. John's moved to a new department, I'm going to examine this, and then either change access automatically, or more likely, send a notification to his previous boss and his current boss that says he has this access. Would you like to extend it for another 30 days? Okay, it'll probably be clicked a lot of times. Can you finish this last project? Sure. You know, as an example, that's the sort of thing that we're talking about in maintaining appropriate access as you move along. So moving from one place to another, you consistently have what you need to do your job. And there's a lot of things tied to that. You need to be able to have a certain access request that's really easy. I need access to these 25 servers. Can I go in and request it? Yes, boom. I need to be able to get access to a particular database and being able to wrap that around the request and approval and know when somebody got access to it. When you start using the lifecycle management for all of this, you start learning the access people need, and then you can start automating it more. And then you have to put in less requests because the system is intelligent enough to understand what you're doing. And that's when you start seeing security enabling you, not being a roadblock. Enabling not being a roadblock. It begins to have that intelligence to understand what you need in which location and to give it to you automatically. I mean, there's a lot of other features around identity management that, you know, they're nice, but I think that one is the one that's really key. Extraordinarily valuable to have that intelligence of when somebody should get what and how valuable, how risky that is, do the certifications around it, but enable this sort of smooth, easy transition from project to project, from role to role, from job to job, without the pain of why is it going to take me 5 days to get the access I want, or 5 weeks, or longer. Birthright provisioning is what we say when somebody joins an organization, there is a set of access they should get automatically. We call it the birthright just because they're coming in IT, in this location, and this is one of their job duties. They should have these 5 roles automatically. It's like the birthright provisioning. You'll get your email account, you'll get your AD account, you'll get your AWS account, you'll get your HR account, you'll get your probably benefits account, those sort of things, and granular level access beneath that, based upon what you're doing. Your operations 3, you get access to these 5 ticketing systems, and you have a role of closer of tickets, have fun with that sort of thing. So it depends really on the target system that you're dealing with. Like sometimes roles are analogous to groups. Like an AD, it's going to be a group. But if you're talking about some systems like, let's call it SAP, or Salesforce.com, or things that have a more complex security model, it ceases to be just group membership. It starts to be tied to roles that you may move in and out of, and locations, and kind of a combination of attributes. They call it role-based access control, or sometimes attribute-based access control if your system's smart enough to look and say they're in Austin and they're on the East Campus and they're trying to do something in nursing, I'm going to give them access to this. Yeah. So sometimes it's groups, but oftentimes a role will be like an aggregation of groups. It depends kind of how it translates down into the target systems where you are giving access into. Does that make sense? Any other questions on this one? I know it's a little bit dense on that. So those were really the 6 key cases that they were trying to deal with. 6 key cases. And they went back, just to review them, it was understand what local AWS users have as access at any given point in time, understand federated users, what they have as access at any point in time, be compliance ready all across the board and continuously so, deal with privileged access across all of those different possible channels, which, as I said, so we'll roll it on that one, just some guiding principles. And to maintain that access consistently. That's really what we spent time working with this customer to put in place. It was a project that took somewhere between the realm of 3 months for phase 1 and at somewhere around 6 months for phase 2 right now. But they have seen dramatic changes in what they have in terms of, hey, I know who has access to what, my auditor isn't mad at me anymore, I'm not going to be in trouble. And they're starting to see the beginning of that intelligent access decision, learned access, that's really helping to speed things up. And that's kind of the holy grail that it's aiming for, by the way. So that's it. Any other questions around that? Or suggestions? I'm looking at you, AWS team. Is anybody still awake? Somebody's still awake. Yes. Question. Oh.
So I know you talked about identity. HR basically, holds identity for most of the organizations. And when you get to cloud, a lot depends upon the application, projects, or whatever. But how do you basically connect? Because they are at such a high level, and then once they start provisioning these applications and things like that, you talk about fine-grained control. They have no clue of, what, fine-grained control of a certain project is. Just try to understand your experience on, what kind of tools, what potentially something that may be out in the AWS itself, there may be some tools, or, how do you bridge those things?
So I can't speak as much to AWS's native tools. I can speak to my organizational tools on this and experience. I don't want to get too organization specific, but bear with me for a minute. What we do when we're dealing with these very fine-grained entitlements and pulling them into a sort of central store is start with one of the first things you want to do is enhance them with some sort of common language understandable descriptor. And somebody's got to do that work. If there's nothing available out there, that is one of the painful parts of the project, is taking something that, an AD is a group of AD 12794 GPS, and figure out what that means, or figure out what an AWS ARN of 563 SUP 234 is. Somebody has to get through that painful process at one point. So what we tend to do is look for things like usage logs, usage data, who has been utilizing this account, and then provide to them a certification sort of review, a review that pops up on their screen. Hey, click log in here, and then these are 5 roles you've been using. Can you give us a description, you know, if you happen to know? And not everybody, I mean, obviously, not everybody's going to, but that's sort of the way you start, is try and figure out somebody out there knows what this does, right? Somebody gave people membership in it, somebody created it. You can target things by watching who's using it and try to bring people into the process of understanding what those fine-grained entitlements are. It can't just be IT. You can't just put this on the shoulders of IT and say, hey, you know, these are entitlements figured out. It doesn't work that way. The business has to be involved somehow. Developers have to be involved somehow to help to understand that. And that's the project in and of itself, but that's how we usually go about it, is bring all the information in, find the commonalities, and then offer it to people who are using it and say, what can you tell me about this? And then as you start to develop that detail about what is the description of this that's a real-time understandable one, then you can start tying that back to, okay, how do I put this into a requestable state if somebody else may need it? But that's a journey. It's always a journey. Helpful? Okay. Hey.
Hey, hi. Going back to the slide on design patterns and anti-patterns for access management and about thick SSH clients specifically.
Yes.
Yes. So now that Windows 10 is including OpenSSH client by default in newer versions, most modern OSs will include OpenSSH specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a role for OpenSSH's more advanced features for access management, such as key signing?
Yes.
Or do you see it being safer to rely on stock RFC stuff, so that other vendors like SSH.com can provide value too?
So this is pure opinion on my part, but I think that the move toward it, and I think Windows 10 providing OpenSSH just involved in it, is an incredible tool to use. But I'm still very much a fan of the notion that you want to have those sessions when you're doing a privileged session. I'm not talking about when you're doing typical work on a machine, you know, typical work. I'm going to connect to the server and do some development on it or move some files, you know, nothing that's not privileged. But from a privileged account session, I am still very strongly in favor of not using those clients, because what we need to be doing is partially that wrapping of logging of that session, wrapping of being able to tie risk to, do I want somebody able to have this access? So that's where I would put the distinction. For day-to-day work, I think that's wonderful. And I think that the capabilities that's wrapping into it are very useful, but I still think that when you're talking privileged stuff, it's a different world, because you have to be able to have those logs. You have to be able to review them at a keystroke level occasionally for if you need to have any sort of investigation and what's been going on after the fact, primarily. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah. I guess the trying to figure out where key signing, which is a feature that's for somewhat esoteric, but seems like it could be applied very well to this. If that's something that like you see things like that happening at the protocol level more, or where things are being designed independently of that, and they don't really have a role to play in this.
Okay, I'm going to have to step out on that one, because I do not claim to have a detailed knowledge of the key signing aspect of it. I'm sorry that I don't have a better response for you on that.
I'm sorry I don't have a better question.
I think it was a great question, because I'm going to go research it as soon as I'm done here. If you have a comment on it, please.
So I guess without my AWS hat on, SSH does support SSH CAs or certificate authorities, and they will do the key signing. It's pretty awesome. They'll do temporal access, so it can be set down to like just in time. You can put time claims on it, and a bunch of other assertions. So it's probably not used as much in the IT security industry as it should be. So SSH CAs for the win.
That's what I'll be looking into. Thank you, AWS team. Are there other questions?
I have a question for him. Does it force you to expire at a certain date?
Yep, so you can acquire the assertions of the SSH CA
So you can do time bound with it, but does it include the logging ability that you need to have sometimes?
The logging ability
Is inherent to what you're actually doing. Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you. We're going to have a drawing for an item here.
Oh, do I get to draw? Yes.
Well, actually, I'm just going to use a.
Oh,
Yeah.
And so,
that's less fun.
Tiana
Oh,
just showed me the new challenge coins for our speakers and VIPs, and I snagged one myself. So if you want to be a speaker, well, we're full this year, but there's always next year. And I'm sure Tiana will do it again. So thank you so much.
thank you. I really enjoyed speaking with you all.